I don't think that it's an exaggeration to say that the election of 1800 was revolutionary. Now, this was not our first election. This was not even the first election in which whoever was president changed hands. However, you go back to 1796 with the election of John Adams. That campaign was between the vice president and the secretary of state, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And John Adams did win, and we did have the peaceful transition of power that I mentioned. However, the transfer of power from Washington to Adams was within the same party. You had one Federalist giving power over to another Federalist. So there wasn't going to be a huge amount of change. There wasn't going to be some kind of big difference between what was going on at that point in time. The election of 1800, however, is very, very different. In this case, we're going to see an election of someone from a completely different party with a completely different political philosophy, and we're going to actually see how well the system works when making a major shift like that. Okay, so as you can see by the map, Thomas Jefferson wins the election of 1800 by a majority of 73 electoral votes to Adams' 65. Now, it is important to remember that under our Constitution, there is a requirement that in order to be elected president, you have to have a majority of the Electoral College. It is not enough to have a plurality. A plurality means you got more votes than anyone else. You have to have a flat out majority. Now, the original way we had things set up, I've mentioned before, was that whoever came in first would become president, whoever came in second would be vice president. And you can see on the map over here that the Democratic Republicans, they're doing quite well the further west you go. The Federalists did really, really well in the Northeast and along the coast. However, you can see there is a definite shift starting to happen. And if you look down at the bottom, it's saying candidate and party. You had Jefferson and Burr for the Democratic Republicans and Adams, Pinckney, and Jay for the Federalists. We're starting to see parties run tickets where you have the parties hopeful for the presidency and the vice presidency. Well, the drawback was in this election, they were still running everything under the old system. And as a result, for the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson and Aaron Burr actually tied in the Electoral College. Okay, so Jefferson wins 73 to 65 over Adams. Even though Adams did receive more popular votes, what really matters is the Electoral College. So you had more popular votes going to Adams. Jefferson does get New York, which was a pretty big prize at the time. But even with this triumph, like I said, it was technically a tie between himself and Aaron Burr. Now, the good news is the framers went through and they anticipated this exact possibility. They really had come up with a plan just in case no one had a majority in the Electoral College. And the plan is, in that situation, it goes to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, each state essentially gets one vote at that point in time, and then they're the ones who vote and make the decision for the presidency. Now, the problem with this is that at this time, even though they were following everything the Constitution had set up, the House was dominated by Federalists. So you now have Federalists going through, and they're the ones who are going to have to decide between two Democratic Republicans as to who's going to be president. Now, obviously, the Federalists would have preferred John Adams to be reelected, or that not being the case, you have Pinckney or Jay or any of the Federalists, they didn't want either one of these guys to actually be president. But their desire on this is really secondary. The Constitution doesn't really care what they, as a party, wanted. It is now their job to go through and try and figure out, all right, what do we do here? Now, this is something that has happened occasionally in regards to U.S. history. It is exceedingly rare, but the good news is that the framers did anticipate things like this could happen. And as a result, they did put the mechanisms in place for there to be a decision made. Now, in this case, like I said, the Federalists are going to have to, as the saying goes, hold their nose, and they're going to have to make the decision between the top two vote getters, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. They don't like their choices, but it's, the old saying is, it's not for you to like, it's for you to do. Now, within the House at this point in time, you got to understand there was no love lost between the Federalists and the Republicans. In fact, they were very hateful of Jefferson. They did not want the man to become president, and quite a few wanted to vote for Burr. The vote was deadlocked for months, and it wasn't until Alexander Hamilton and John Adams put their weight into the argument. Now, do not, by any stretch of the imagination, think that Alexander Hamilton and John Adams wanted Thomas Jefferson to be president. That was not what they were thinking. What they were thinking more was that they could not stand Thomas Jefferson, but they liked him better than they did Aaron Burr. There was the concern that Aaron Burr would be the worst choice. So Hamilton and Adams put their influence into convincing the House to vote for Thomas Jefferson. For lack of a better term, they saw Jefferson as the lesser of two evils. They didn't think either one of these was a great choice, but they did go with the one they could stomach the most, I guess is the best way to phrase it. So they convinced a few House members to change their votes. They knew that voting for Burr was going to cause a lot more harm to their party. And so, again, Federalists held their nose and passed their voting responsibility. Few of them did finally change their minds. Jefferson is elected to the presidency, and we have a truly revolutionary time frame at this point in time. We have one political party is now going to voluntarily give over the reins of government to another political party. The Democratic Republicans had not just won the presidency, but they had also picked up a majority in the Congress. And as a result, this meant that the Federalists were pretty much going to be out in the cold, and the Democratic Republicans were going to be literally in charge of just about every aspect of government. The Federalists didn't like this, and the Jeffersonian Republicans loved it, but at the same time, this was the way things were set up. It was supposed to be designed that we could have this change. And so now we were going to see, did we not only have it down in writing, but how was it going to play out in the real world? That was the question. Now, the Revolution of 1800 was revolutionary because, first and foremost, we did have the peaceful transfer of power. The Federalists did step down. Okay, it wasn't a situation where they had power and they then tried to hold on to it even though they had lost the election. It wasn't that they had, for lack of a better term, called out the troops and were determined to hold the capital, kind of thing like that, against the barbarians at the gate that they saw, the Democratic Republicans as being. But we did have the peaceful transfer of power. The Federalists stepped down from office after Jefferson had won. They did so peacefully. Though, like I said, they were not necessarily happy about it. I've even read that John Adams didn't even go to congratulate his former friend, Mr. Jefferson, but instead, as soon as he was done being president, headed back to Massachusetts to go home. He didn't even want to say anything. Jefferson and Adams, I've mentioned before, had been very good friends at one time. They had a falling out. The good news is that they do eventually reconcile and get back to being friends, so that's always the happy story. So the Federalists step down peacefully. They don't like it, but they do it. The Republicans, the other aspect of this was that the Republicans were now seen as more of the People's Party as compared to the Federalists. The Federalists had come across as essentially, elitist and aristocratic, and that they knew better than the common person, and that's why they should get elected. And that didn't go over well with the people. Generally speaking, the American electorate has a tendency to not like to be spoken down to. They don't want a political party or a candidate to tell them how dumb they are or something along those lines. People have a tendency to take exception to things like that. So we do have this change. We are seeing a massive shift in power in regards to the political parties. And what's more, we're seeing that while the Constitution was set up for this peaceful transfer of power, we didn't know how well it was going to work, but it did. We went through, we got a brand new president, we had a brand new Congress essentially, and these were individuals who had a very, very different political philosophy than the Federalists. And yet, here we are, we got through everything, and we had survived.